Readings 2. The sixth applied precept. I bear witness to the reality of blame and the avoidance of responsibility in myself and in the world, and aspire to speak of others with openness and possibility. Traditionally, not discussing the faults of others. The problem with Harry. As always, Diane Rossetto sends us firmly back to ourselves to examine this precept. I catch myself dropping a comment to my husband about someone we both think is not very reliable. A comment that is in itself a judgment, though one that's been made previously. The practice here, as she outlines it, is to suspend or bracket out our judgment and ask instead about the judging itself. How do I think I know this, and why am I saying this to him, and here, and now? So this is clearly beginning as a continuation of our work with the fourth precept. What's the truth of what's going on here? This is a very useful strategy, but as with all strategies, it has its limitations. What happens when I bring this back to the complexity of my life as it is, in the infinitely complex world we all share? Is this precept simply telling me not to judge, lest I be judged, or only have to say nice things about people? And am I the real problem here with my curious, selfishly judgmental ways? We can certainly see that we all do share a tendency to label, to pigeonhole, to categorise people and things. Are we judging their actions, or are we judging them as people? This is actually a vital distinction to which we'll return later. We looked last time at our need to know as an expression both of our unacknowledged vulnerability and our compensatory attempts to control our world. As I said in the introduction, we all want to be right, and this in both the strong senses of the word. I want to be factually right and I want to be morally right, because being morally right gives me rights that guarantee my own safety and position. We too easily become barristers in our own impromptu courtrooms and are happy to move from there to being both judge and jury, abstracting and decontextualizing, assigning individual responsibility, making our universalizing judgments, separating. I've already pointed to the supposed naturalness of this kind of reaction and suggested that we might more usefully see it as the personal expression of a culturally specific approach. If we assume that society is just the coming together of an entirely separate individuals in permanent competition with each other, then we can equally assume we all act permanently selfishly and buttress our assumptions with examples from sociobiology and animal behaviour. We will ask many times as we go along, cui bono, who benefits? The immediate answer here is, of course, my sense of self, of self-worth and worthiness, of being someone, if only on my own personal stage. Now, I learn this lesson in my own family, at school, at work, through sports and in endless cop and game shows on TV. But the imaginary game of all against all is played at a level and for stakes far beyond my wildest dreams. It's not my game, however much I insist on or deny my taking part. It's important to say this because Zen and Buddhist thought brings with it a reflexive self-judgment. It's my fault, it's my ego's fault that I act this way. This is the judgment the game requires of each of us. The fantasy of self-reliance, self-responsibility in a world of utter interdependence of interbeing. So we can take this precept at the most immediate and pragmatic level. Look how I keep making these endless dumb judgments about other people and try to avoid drawing the required conclusion. I must be so bad, so selfish. Or we can allow it to provide an entry point to the way in which we each show up as this world, neither guilty nor blameless. So let's begin. Diane Rossetto. A good way to explore this precept and how to use it for everyday decision making is to try out the following exercise for a week or two. Stop. Take inventory. Take 1 week to begin noticing the obvious and subtle ways in which you talk about others overtly, surreptitiously, covertly. Keep a journal. Look. Focus in. Choose 1 or 2 specific ways in which you talk about others and where and under what conditions you do it. Listen. Hear your words as you speak. Pay close attention to the tone of your voice, noticing what happens to your voice and your word choice when you stop simply sharing information and begin discussing thoughts. Experience. Notice if there seems to be any emotional charge present. You might notice it makes you feel good to talk about someone else. Maybe it relieves some bodily tension. Sometimes people say they feel physically bigger, stronger. Your body sensations are a good indicator here. If you're feeling some tightness, there's a good chance that your comments are fueled by some negative feelings. Continue looking, listening, and experiencing in this way until you clarify the emotion. For example, you might notice there's some jealousy feeding your comment. We'll pause there for a moment. Rossetto particularises this. She was making her judgment on Harry. Harry can't be depended upon. She asks us to rephrase this global statement about Harry to something more true. It's been my experience that. Now it's about relationship and about my perception and my interpretation of what I see as his unreliability. If I freeze that complex and ever-changing living being into undependable Harry, I've separated him out, reified him as some thing, permanently limited and other. I've created a fixed identity for him and a negative identity at that, and this identity will now be subject to confirmation bias in my dealings with Harry, or yours too, if you accept my judgment on him. I'll be expecting, looking for the signs, holding my breath to be able to say, look, I told you so. He was like that. It's always the same way. This is why Rossetto asks us to stay close to our experiencing and to be honest about it. It's actually really hard to step back from our judgment once we've made it. My sankaras around Harry cause me genuinely to see him and to hear his words in a particular way. But if I'm able to become aware of the difference in my body and in my emotional response between Harry is and in my experience Harry is, then I may be able to respond differently in my assumptions and actions. This actually takes us on towards the 7th precept and meeting others on equal ground. If I don't bring my preconceptions to this meeting between us, or those about people like you, then what? Diane's development of the practice, deepening the inquiry, goes on to ask us the kind of questions we're already becoming familiar with. What am I adding? How does talking in this way affect my own self-image? She asks us to make an important imaginative exchange. Now try seeing yourself in the other person and honestly try to find examples in yourself where you've been like the person you are discussing. How am I undependable? Watch for situations where you may not follow through. In other words, look at your own behaviour. The idea is to keep an open awareness about your behaviour without judgment or even trying to change it, although that may happen quite naturally once you become aware of your actions. What's your experience now? How do you feel about this other person? About yourself? She asks us to consider if we feel less judgmental now, or perhaps even some guilt or other similar feelings. Bringing this back to ourselves into experiencing our own resistance to our feelings, our desire not to feel bad, and especially not to feel bad about ourselves. If I do not find fault, what's the worst thing that could happen, she asks. She points to the way our responses to others always show us something about ourselves, our deeper assumptions, our fears, our demands that the world should be a certain way, and instead to allow ourselves to sit with these as koans about ourselves. She gives the example of a student whose anger at his sister's repeated requests for money showed him his own hidden determination that everyone, including him, should always be able to take care of themselves, which had led him often to being unable to ask for the help that he needed. Such beliefs are what we hold on to dearly because they make us feel safe and in control. I think this statement is profound and vitally important. I think it also is the key to extending the practice around this precept further and deeper. We might respond to Diane's student's realization in Buddhist terms. In a world of impermanence, of interdependence and interbeing, such an attitude of universal self-reliance simply makes no sense. It can only lead us away from recognizing and bearing witness to our all too human vulnerability and mutual dependency, which are at the very heart of our practice. But we can take this further. Is this simply his belief? Is this universal human nature? Is this some quirk uniquely his, or maybe something he got passed on from his family growing up? In terms of relationship, how does his sister's inability to look after herself figure? Is he the one who can and she the one who can't? What about their parents' attitudes and how they feel towards him, towards her? How does his sister think about herself? And what about the wider picture? We might bring gender in again here. In a world of very real inequality of opportunity, and with the contradictory expectations placed on women, have a career or at least hold down a job while being a homemaker and a perfect mother. So how does all that figure in her aspiration, her sense of success or failure? And where does the idea of self-reliance really come from? Isn't it an essential part, a cornerstone of the American dream? The frontiersman reliant only on his wits and his trusty rifle, the businessman building up a corporation from nothing. Both fantasies that mask both actual exploitation and the greater reality of infinite interdependence. I am sick because the world is sick. Practice questions. What judgments on others do I find myself making? What ideas or assumptions lie behind my own reflexive responses to others? Where does my own deepening awareness lead? The three of us. But to return to Diane and her judgment on Harry, there's a third party here too, who only gets a passing mention in the vignette, but whose role is in some ways the most important of all, Diane's husband. Note that this precept isn't initially flagging up criticising someone to their face, but to others. This isn't about not going behind someone's back, even if that is rarely a good idea, but about the nature of judgment itself. There is a demand in making a judgment, a demand bordering on an assumption that we all will, that we all must agree with it. Diane demands her husband agree about Harry. Now, as this isn't the first time she's talked with him about this, all's well. But if her husband were a big fan of Harry's, an argument might have ensued. Harmony and their shared identity as a couple would be shaken. But as this is something they can agree on, their own bond is reaffirmed by othering Harry in this way. Now let's scale this up. This is actually how our whole society works, by making collective judgments to which it is demanded that we all tacitly or actively agree. We can see this happening all the way from the law courts to stand-up comedy. Comedy actually provides an interesting barometer of the edges of the acceptable, of what can successfully demand our agreement. The observational comedian sets up an "isn't it funny that life's like this" scenario and riffs on it. If that is the way we in the audience see the world, then we fall about laughing. If not, then she bombs. She may see the world that way, but that's only her opinion, not ours. It is not so long since it was the actual basis of much comedy to parade the most familiar and limiting derogatory stereotypes to make us laugh at the otherness of people we were taught to perceive as different. All mother-in-laws were fat and stupid. All blonde women were vain and stupid. All BIPOC or BAME, non-white men, were deferential and stupid, or else sex-crazed, drug-addicted and stupid. Non-white women were, barely seen at all as they performed their poorly paid, low-status jobs. If you happen to be identified by others as any of these things, then you're expected to laugh along, to share the joke, and hence to accept the judgment made on you, or at the very least to accept it being made. Accept the right of others to hold you in contempt. In the last week, as I was writing this, we've had the latest allegations about Russell Brand, reminding us that even putting to one side those accusations of actual sexual assault, the basis of his alleged comedy lies in expressing an unbridled misogyny, and that in this he's been in no way an exception, but merely one of its most skillful and successful exponents. Comedy is and remains one of the many arenas in which we can see negotiation happening in real time between differing views of what judgments we can demand agreement on at a societal level. But there are very many other places to observe this happening, all the way up to formal government policy and professional philosophers. Sir James' judgment brings, if only implicitly, the whole of society to bear down on poor Harry, or at least to claim that it should. This judgment is just what anyone would think in this situation. As Dan has pointed out already, it's important for us to understand how we generalise a specific experience into a global judgment that freezes Harry into a separate fixed thing, and by doing so shapes how we think about him, talk about him, and how we and others act towards him. It really does matter significantly whether we understand and act on each of these judgments as being particular or global, as accidental or existential. Although the consequences will be dramatically different, it's the same question whether it's a question of my own offhand remark, or a stand-up comedian's live set, or the framing of primary legislation in Parliament or Congress. Often it can be unclear, or even made deliberately unclear, how far the judgment is about people's actions or their actual being. If you judge me for my actions, I can try to justify them to you or challenge your evidence or interpretation. But if you judge me for my simply being who I am, or for just being other in your eyes, then what can I do? Often we hide global judgments behind alleged actions or inclinations. There has been, for example, much concern in the UK recently about the numbers of Albanian men claiming asylum here. Nobody will admit that this is simply because these men are Albanian and we associate Albania with all kinds of badness, but they'll point instead to the prevalence of mafia-style organised crime within this small and poor Balkan state, arguing that men who just happen to be Albanian will therefore inevitably act in criminal ways in the UK. Or the famous characterisation by Donald Trump of all Mexicans as drug dealers and rapists. It's not because they're Mexican, they just all really are that way, in and of themselves. We're only fooled if we want to be, if we want to maintain the appearance of fairness, perhaps even to ourselves, while denying its actual substance. Where we set the boundary between us and them is also important. The English traditionally told derogatory jokes about the Irish, while in Ireland itself similar jokes were told about Kerrymen, those from the far west of the island. Do we feel the same about Albanian women as Albanian men? Was Trump only talking about male Mexicans? So, ad nauseum. Practice questions. Hearing or reading the news or in conversations, just who is being othered? How much do I really know? And what is the source of this knowledge? What assumptions are being made in how these stories are being told? How do I experience in my body my agreement or disagreement with these assumptions? What broader patterns are they a part of? How does this relate to my personal experience? Us and them. These kind of global judgments establish overlapping in-groups and out-groups of us and them, of people like us and people like them. I talked last time about binary inequalities in relation to truth and to justice. Within any of these inequalities, what makes it definitionally unequal, one side is favoured over the other. Our side is always the superior, the right, in both senses, side. Sometimes the different inequalities align well, sometimes cross or contradict. In Western societies, the wealthy tend to be white, better educated, healthier and male, but being a British citizen, which is in itself to enjoy real privilege in global terms, is split roughly 50-50 between men and women. In reality, I will always find myself on different sides of an inequality at different times. I might be rich in one context and poor in another, now ignored because I'm only a woman and then seen as embodying privilege because I'm acting white. I might be a respected professional in one moment, then arrested or worse for the crime of running while black, deferred to as a man of means and then dismissed as posh, stuck up, out of touch. But all this is in no way an equality of inequality. Which side I find myself on and where and when can make all the difference in the world to my life chances or even my chance of remaining alive itself. The gross levels of unfairness within our societies may seem a very long way from Diane's simple judgmental remark to her husband about Harry. And of course that's so, but it's a small-scale version of the same mechanism, the same reflex of judgment. So, should she hang her head in shame for having made it? Does it make her the same as any misogynist or racist bigot? And how useful even are those terms? Of course not. That would move towards the same kind of global judgment on her, even if as a judgment by her on herself. And what we're talking about here is exactly that tendency in which we all share to slide towards freezing, immobilizing, reifying, and then globalizing our judgments and those of others we offer our assent to. As soon as we judge the person, not the action, not only do we separate from them in the most radical sense, we also enter the world of shame and shaming. To be shamed is to be judged naked before the world, if only in our own imagination. To shame and be shamed is to judge existentially that I or you or they have been, are and will ever be bad, failing, lacking in some essential quality. That I or you or they are wrong, not right. As we've already noted, there is no definitive dividing line here between action and person, made more problematic in that we're all dealing with what is most difficult and most embarrassing for us. So many ways to attempt to evade actually seeing the nets in which we're already caught. If I've already judged you before the whole world, even if that whole world is represented only by my husband, then your every word and action will confirm it to me. But what if it's me being judged as failing, as lacking, as bad? We've already touched on this too. As a woman, I've been expected to laugh with the sexists or lack a sense of humour? As a black woman, how much of the casual racism I additionally encounter can I evade or ignore? And when to play along, and when and where to challenge? And how will I be seen then? With all of this, whoever I am, how to be simply myself, whoever and whatever that might be, in this moment. Practice questions. Practice noticing the experience of finding myself situated on either side of these inequalities. We began with this, the previous precept practice. How do I think they are experienced by the person on the other side? How is the experience of crossing from privileged side to less privileged, or vice versa? Impotent bigness. But say instead I'm an able-bodied, assigned male at birth, heterosexual, white male, born into the entitlement that patriarchy and racist colonialism have conferred on me. Entitlement so instinctive, so unconsciously held, that I'm shocked to see it named as such. Entitlement made to seem merely natural, merely the way things are by both the structures of society itself and the attitudes of those I encounter. Surely I am, or should be able to feel myself to be, the master of the universe. Surely if I truly am what I'm told I am, if I am what I am told I should be, to be what I am, then truly I should have women falling at my feet. I should struggle and compete and emerge victorious. I should stand alone as the noble warrior whose stoic restraint is tempered by acts of extreme but necessary violence in the pursuit or defence of what I hold dear. My success should be visible to all. If we doubt the collective hold this vision of masculinity has within our culture, doubt how dominant and relentlessly promoted it is both within the mainstream and on the fringes, then the billions of views of Andrew Tate's videos, predominantly by teenage boys, are a good starting point. Our teenagers are the most sensitive barometer of our cultural attitudes. They've everything to play for and everything to lose in the game of life, and relatively little cultural or financial capital to work with. But the image of masculinity promoted by Tate is far from the most extreme, can be confirmed by reading Laura Bates' soul-crushing Men Who Hate Women, the researching and writing of which was in itself an act of heroic bravery. This version of masculinity is a fantasy that I am in reality condemned to fail to live out, the fantasy that will lead me to harm others in direct ratio to both my belief in it and my despair at my failure to embody it in my real life. To the extent that I choose or feel obligated or forced to participate, I cannot hope but fail. The examples of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are paradigmatic here. Even to be president, to be prime minister, is not enough, can never be enough, can never satisfy. I can never prove to myself that I've succeeded, won, finally achieved in other than the most fleeting sense. Never proved beyond my own unreasonable doubt that I exist. Hannah Arendt's wonderfully resonant description of the perpetual struggle to fill the void that powers our restless society is impotent bigness. It's the expression of the fallacious ideal of a society based in the permanent competition of entirely self-sufficient individuals, and not even a question of whether I want to be a part of this or not. The organisation of our society channels and limits the possibilities of my existence, depending on the cultural and economic capital I've been given. This inevitability of failure is itself what sustains the system, keeps the wheels turning. Dominance and accumulation are dangerously addictive. How will each of us respond to this? So, in playing the role of man, of course I don't think like that, or I don't think I think like that. I've come to realise suddenly or over time that this is not what I want or what I ever really wanted or even something I was ever in any way cut out for. But what then? How can I make a more honest and realistic life from the resources, emotional, intellectual, cultural, economic, that are at my disposal? And how to escape the seemingly inevitable weight of judgment and self-judgment? If I've a glimmer of self-awareness, I will be all too frequently aware of the many ways, small and large, in which I act out aspects of exactly that masculinity, whose grosser aspects I so vehemently repudiate. My self-judgments too often stem from unconsciously taking that masculinity as the gold standard of what I am, what I should be as a man, and hence also as being human. In what way are these really self-judgments? Who is actually making them? I make them on behalf of others. My image of my society, my parents, my peers. What they would, must think of me. Is my sense of self fragile and defended in denial of its own vulnerability is based firmly in those conventional and durable binary inequalities, such as man, woman, that need constant reinforcement, then the blaming of others, judging them, is an effective way of policing my own boundaries, of establishing the difference between me and not me, and of ensuring that me always sits on the side of virtue, goodness, and entitlement. Those durable binary inequalities that appear fixed, man, woman, white, black, are central to this policing. Hence the violence of the feelings, and also often the actions, provoked by any apparent transgression of them, from miscegenation to gender ideology. In a world in which we're in constant competition, where in reality we find ourselves implicitly or explicitly in a state of perpetual challenge to our dominance, there's a sense of safety and grounding in our offloading, our outsourcing of the ambivalence of our sense of self-worth onto others. There is an important truth here. We judge because we have been judged in the past, and we fear judgment in the future. We judge because we've spent a lifetime plastering over the cracks in our life, cracks through which the void can be glimpsed. I attempt to fix, to freeze the other in order to give stability to myself. By making you in and as yourself bad, I attempt to make myself good. By making you failing, lacking, I attempt to make myself a success, a fullness, and so attempt to fill the emptiness which I feel is at my core. And so, at a still deeper level, my separation, my distinction, my pushing away from you is the very condition of my own existence. Because if I can't be good, then I'll be bad, because at least to be bad is to exist. And much of the time, we don't even really believe we do. So here we have our two basic strategies of separation. While one may predominate, both coexist, unhappily in each of us. I am good and exist because you're bad, or I exist only in my badness. I am defined by it. And the latter is shame. Practice questions. Reading this, how do I respond in my body, in my emotions? What thoughts arise? How do these connect with my sense of being a woman, being non-binary, being a man? Shamed and shaming. Shame is our dirty secret, the hidden force which drives us and which we are, quite literally, ashamed to mention. We would rather do pretty much anything than experience shame, the more so because shame itself is shaming. The fear of the experience of shame casts a long shadow. We will instinctively turn away from it, dissociate, zone out, respond with anger and challenge. Prison psychologist James Gilligan has chronicled how shame, or the fear of it, makes men attack or actually kill others, because to live as shamed is really not to live at all. Shame may make us mute, may make us hide and wish to disappear, or to actually make the attempt to disappear forever. But what experientially do we mean by shame? Full-blown shame, and we've all felt it, is that deep sinking in the pit of your stomach as, aware of every creepy inch of your skin, you feel super exposed to everyone's view and simply want to crawl away and hide, or worse. You can barely see, barely hear. The world disappears and all that remains is your own awfulness, your hopeless, ridiculous awfulness. Maybe you run, if only in your mind, and maybe you fight with fists or words or weapons, anything to change how you feel, to erase this unbearable feeling with anger, or to stop feeling anything at all. But paradoxically, while this is an emotion we may feel with overpowering and intimate intensity, and one that we will go to almost any lengths to avoid, it's also the most social of our emotions. Shame is the psychophysical experience of what we instinctively feel to be a social judgment that, although about something specific, appears to show up my general and permanent failure to be what I want, should, aspire, or appear to be, or can never be. I can be shamed as a man for not being a real man, and hence being symbolically a kind of woman. I can be shamed as a woman for not being a real woman, for not behaving as a man wants me to. I can be shamed for being black, and hence not sharing the innate virtues you consider part of whiteness. I can be shamed simply because you are dominant in our relationship, and you choose to ignore me, for example, if we're parent and child. However it arises, this is a judgment on myself that I'm powerless to resist, a judgment that I myself, who, can and do make on myself. On whom? I make it on behalf of others. So we can talk of shame as being the negative experience of awareness of self in relation to others in our family, community and society. We learn shame in childhood at the hands of our parents and peers. Psychoanalyst Philip Bromberg argues that if our thoughts and emotions as emergent independent selves are consistently not affirmed and validated by our caregivers, the result is developmental trauma that produces deep shame. A failure of responsiveness by the mother or father to some genuine aspect of the child's self, not necessarily open disapproval or abusiveness, but a masked withdrawal from authentic contact that leaves the child experiencing part of herself as having no pleasurable value to a loved other, and thus no relational experience as part of me. The child's own need for loving recognition becomes despised and shame-ridden. The need becomes a dissociated not me aspect of self that, when triggered, releases not only unmet hunger for authentic responsiveness, but a flood of shame. That's from Awakening the Dreamer. Shame is the overwhelming experience of not mattering, not counting, of being nobody, of being already dead. I am witness, if only in my imagination, to my own casting out from family or society. I am not relatable to, I cannot have relationship. I cannot ever truly meet an other, and hence, or because of that, I do not really exist myself. Risotto's examples we met in our work on the previous precept may touch into shame. The nurse silenced by the unarticulated threat of shaming. What's the worst thing that could happen? To be shamed. the brother feeling unnamed shame at his sister's neediness, which, when examined, resolved itself into sadness. How would Harry feel if told of Diane's judgment of his unreliability and her husband's agreement with it? Well, it probably depends on how he's grown up with shame. Does he feel vulnerable to any slight? Does he see Diane's opinion as mattering to the world at large or not? Would he respond with false laughter, with a wry smile, a counter-judgment, with silence, with anger? Rossetto's treatment of this precept moves us towards exactly how judgment, shame and identity relate to each other. My specific experience of Harry tends towards a global judgment which creates an identity for him, unreliable, by which he is then implicitly or explicitly shamed as inadequate. It's been argued that we actually only learn to become the social beings we are, that we so diligently learn the rules of how to behave in the broadest possible sense in response to the fear of being shamed, of repeating our past experience of this. So our extreme shame avoidance motivates us to learn what is approved, what is permitted and what is not. This is obviously partly a question of prevailing morality, of what our society thinks of as right and wrong, but extends much more widely, as, for example, with our gender expression, where shame avoidance motivates us to walk, talk, or sit like a man, or like a woman, or else to face the censure of being shamed. Shame has a normative function here. It's the stick that enforces a standard to which to conform within our community. I may be shamed, made to feel shame, by the judgment of any member of that community, including, of course, myself, acting as the judge on myself in accordance with our shared values. The carrot is the active recognition of my belonging that I hope to experience when I do behave properly, when I keep to the words and actions of the socially sanctioned script. This is the reason that it's often said within Buddhism that shame is actually a positive emotion when we feel it in relation to having done something wrong, in that it calls us to reflect on what we've done and change our ways accordingly. Clearly, these are different senses of shame we're talking about, but they do all connect up. The shame I might feel at not being able to throw a basketball well, or having been found out about a lie, clearly isn't by nature the same as that Bromberg discusses. One is a self-judgment on my action, the other is self-judgment on myself. But a major point of this precept is precisely the way that one slides into the other, becomes general, global, existential. Let's say I'm a boy and I get told, you throw like a girl. This is at base merely an observation on the throwing of ball, but it's clearly not only that. It challenges the fixed stereotypical and symbolic identity that I hold. I am a man, and offers an equally fixed stereotypical and symbolic alternative identity. But really, in this respect at least, you are a girl, and hence lesser and a fraud to boot by failing to demonstrate the reality of my claim to be a boy. It's true gender shaming. I move from dominant to subordinate. I am shamed in the full sense. I must learn to appear, to throw like a boy, or know myself to be, at root and in my heart, to be a failed boy, a non-boy, and hence a girl. And so to live in shame. Gilligan points to the central role of gender in shaming, this first and preeminent binary inequality which we'll return to later. Whether this single event changes my life, I become England men's, or women's for that matter, next star fast bowler, or never leave my bedroom again, or instead just cheerfully return the insult and hence play the game in that way, all that will depend on how the infinite complexity of my interactions with family and peers have and will connect up as the person I become. If we set the task of playing, as we all are, an unwinnable game in the competition of life, then we're all exposed to this deep form of shaming, which takes us to the dark side of judgment and to the use of shaming as a way of establishing and maintaining dominance and control. If we grew up in a family where shaming was in any way routine, then the consequences will be severe and long-lasting. I'll reiterate how important it is to understand how shame connects us to the durable binary oppositions we've discussed. It's normally being on the disempowered side of any binary that will open us to shame as being lesser, less powerful, less virtuous, less in control. Attempting to reverse the terms of the binary in the language used is one coping strategy. All men are rapists, or the reappropriation of queer and dyke. These are bad and sick as approbation. As we all in our actual lives cross and recross the boundaries of these binaries, our shame may follow us. I'm a hugely successful professional, and yet I feel worthless. Is that childhood trauma? Failure to conform to some ideal code of appearance? The possibilities are endless. As we've touched on, to feel shame is itself shaming, intensely so. The more power I appear to others to have, the more keenly I may feel the shame of whatever. Related to this, if I instead lack what I feel should be the due, the entitlement of being on the dominant side of a major inequality, for instance being white or British or male, then the shame may be amplified still further by the shamefulness of feeling shame that no man, no Briton, no white man should have to feel. The unbearable nature of this shame may well displace onto anger and onto violence. Of course, shaming is itself the outcome of the experience of shame. As with so many forms of violence, my injury leads directly to further harm to myself and to others. Practice question. Can I allow myself gentle entry into my experience of the shame emotions, even if I'm not aware of experiencing deep shame? What makes me embarrassed? What makes me blush? How actually is the felt experience of this? And what thoughts or stories arise? Killing shame. Shaming itself is the outcome of the experience of shame. If the shaming takes or is not explicitly challenged, then dominance has been established or maintained, and this was its purpose. So resistance to our shaming will itself be challenged. Do you call me a snowflake for getting upset in response to a gendered or a racist slur? Or even ask me, can't you take a joke then? It carries with it the same function of shaming, the use of shame as a relation of dominance by the withholding of recognition. The shame emotions do indeed tie me to society, to my group, and place me in relation to all of its members. In fact, their primary function is to keep me in my place through offering me or withholding me recognition. Shame in this sense is always about hierarchy, about relationships of power. These may be very obvious or very subtle, and we begin to learn them from the moment of our birth as we learn to be shamed and learn also to shame others, and of course ourselves in turn. As we touched on above, we're all shamed by our parents as they were shamed before us. We're shamed by our peers and we will shame them also. We will attempt to deny, displace or repress our own being shamed, or act it out as retaliation, as depression, or as violence. We may be overwhelmed by our own experience of perceived inadequacy, or even construct for ourselves and others the image of a supreme self-confidence, unconcerned and even unaware of the real existence of other people. The shamed personality style that we call narcissism. It's this social dimension of shame that means it can and will be used as a weapon against ourselves and against others. We all share the experience of being both the victim of shaming and of shaming others. We all live in the fear of being shamed. Shaming is never random, but may often appear trivial to others, but follows the lines of identities and inequalities. The rules and expectations of correct behaviour differ by specific context, but are always framed through distinctions of age, gender, class, race, ability, and the other significant inequalities. Shaming always has the intention of establishing or maintaining hierarchy. The practice of shaming is one of the most significant ways that we try to exercise control over others. But behind it lurks the fear, which demands that we also police ourselves to avoid being shamed in turn. Avoiding the experience of shame is an important motivation to shape myself, to acquire skills, take on social roles. Shaming and its avoidance is a key mechanism by which we place ourselves in and maintain an established social order, one of the key instruments by which I become me and define myself in relation to others. It's an active separation that still binds me to those others, and does so whether the shame is held to be theirs or mine. So shaming is a form of symbolic violence we inflict on ourselves and others towards ends which were at once both individual and social. Our attempts to avoid or erase this symbolic violence of shame may themselves lead directly to further and more damaging acts of physical or psychological violence. We can see this played out on the international stage, with consequences as disastrous as they are tragic. In an address to a joint session of Congress on the 20th of September 2001, in the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11, when cool heads were much needed, President George W. Bush famously said the following: "Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." A global judgment indeed, and one entirely without nuance. It's hard to see the prime motivation in the invasions of either Afghanistan or Iraq as other than shame, and gendered shaming at that. The destruction of the Twin Towers, that central phallic embodiment of the United States' global economic dominance and exceptionism, a violation, symbolic and actual, of the never-challenged territorial integrity so fundamental to the US's self-myth. Hence the only possible response to this symbolic feminization being a reassertion of the most violent masculinity on a global scale, to shame more massively in return. It's part of this image of masculinity itself that the oppressed and defenceless women and children of Afghanistan were invoked as an additional alibi for this punitive conquest, male aggression cloaking itself as virtuous defence of powerless femininity. Hence, too, how little thought was given to the beyond of this conquest, the difficult and ongoing what happens next. The most cursory reading of Afghan history, ancient and modern, showing that no conqueror has succeeded in establishing more than a temporary presence, because every conqueror has been ultimately ejected through simple attrition. A punitive shaming was the point, as later in Iraq, and the point was strongly made that 20 years later Western forces beat an ignominious retreat from Afghanistan, and that the reconstructed Iraq still suffers endless internal troubles, should perhaps shame the West more deeply than did the initial assault on the United States. It should show us that a response in the same terms of that of 9/11 itself, more than 1 million actual human lives taken in the cause of a symbolic gendered shaming, was always entirely inappropriate, and that the dissemination of Western values, had that been the point, could never be done down the barrel of a gun. Such is the outcome of a reflexive violence as a response to shaming, exactly as James Gilligan had described in detail in the case of the individual prisoners he worked with in Massachusetts prisons. But here the response was a collective one. There was enormous domestic support for these shaming wars, and of course enormous opposition to them too. Gilligan came to the conclusion that both the majority of violence that resulted in imprisonment and the violence within the prison system itself was gendered. Violence is the only possible masculine response to the symbolic emasculation and hence feminisation of being shamed. We'll return to this theme and I'll look at some of the later precepts, but for now a couple of obvious questions at least need to be noted. Men, of course, don't have to make a physically violent response, and we mostly don't. According to our position in society and family experience growing up, we may displace, deflect or deny our shame and shaming, and for the most part remain functional, if more constrained, human beings. It will still figure, still show up, as in the eagerness of a president and much of his people to go to war to avenge an insult. We may also take the route of fully internalising our shame, acting it out primarily towards ourselves as self-reproach, self-censorship, self-limitation, self-harm. This is the primary route offered towards those of us who are women. There has only recently been significant research into the forms of shaming experienced by women, coming from the side of the marked, the other term of the gender binary. If we're all asked to play an unwinnable game, then undoubtedly the extra rules imposed on women make the game still harder. Be the right kind of mother, have a career, have the perfect body, always appear happy, always be available. Unsurprisingly, the self-policing and policing of others through shame have much to do with the female body as to how it appears and how it functions, as, unlike a man, one cannot reassert one's symbolically challenged femininity through physical violence. Different strategies emerge, often more internal and hence often too more damaging to self, whether as depression, as cutting, through eating disorders. I'm not in any way suggesting that any of these are necessarily a direct outcome of the experience of shame, but in these and so many other forms of harming, shame lurks, and our attempt to evade it, experiencing, leads us towards further real harm. Practice questions. Can I notice examples of how my experience of embarrassment, guilt, or full-blown shame frames my reactions and responses to challenge or to criticism? Turning towards, turning away. We instinctively turn away from shame. We turn from life as it is and head instead deep, deep into our fantasy of self. We could talk about Joko Beck's core beliefs in terms of shame, in the physicality of its experiencing and of its global nature. I am unworthy, unlovable, unrecognised. This is indeed the script that underlies all shaming. It's vitally important to understand that shame is an absolutely social script, albeit one that seems most private. My business, my shameful secret. Because shame is itself shaming. But shame goes to the heart of what it is to be human, to be social animals, unimaginable without others, meaningless in isolation from our peers, needing the mutuality of recognition to know we exist. How can we turn towards shame and towards its healing? As we'll begin to look at in our work with the next precept, it's through meaningful connection, the establishment of mutual recognition, of relationship. This is something I do with myself, myself, on the cushion, and with others in my daily life. On the cushion we can begin to allow ourselves actually to experience this shame intimately and to resist the stories, the narratives we weave around it. We can learn to hold it and allow it to fade, dissolve, transform, or simply to lose its ability to move us reflexively towards denial and the harming of self and other which follow. Shame is not the end of the world or the end of us. however much it may feel like it. It's an embodied physical experience like any other. Although she doesn't name shame, Rosetto's practice question is highly relevant here. What's the worst thing that could happen? But we do need first to be able to see shame for what it is. We are all masters of evasion, displacement, substitution, anything rather than directly experience our shame. Are we, in Joko's phrase, a big enough container to hold our shame without in turn shaming ourselves further or shaming others? This is begin to recognise ourselves. To recognise ourselves, which we do in taking ourselves whole. But to recognise ourselves is also to recognise the other. And to recognise the other is to recognise myself. No me without you. You can't be yourself by yourself, as Barry Magid says. On the cushion in the kitchen at work, I'm never alone. Shame isolates us not only as individuals but also in our identities, the frozen states, and always threatening to thaw into something more human, by which we build and maintain in-group and out-group, just as we build and maintain me and not me within each of us. Those to whom we would pass on the shame we've provisionally contained as not me, we collectively treat with vindictive contempt or patronising concern. The illegal immigrant, the prisoner, are there to carry out our own shame away from us, as the biblical scapegoat carried sin off into the desert. But in our case, it's not into the desert, but to the confinement of human lives, immobilised and left in a suspension that we, in our shame, instead name as our overgenerous indulgence of them. We've travelled far from Rosetto's offhand remark about Harry, but our practice always begins with and returns us to the intimacy of our immediate experiencing. With our work, with this precept, we've gone by way of individual and collective shame, the prisoner's cell and the war in Afghanistan, not separate. In the spirit of a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Coming to awareness of each of our judgments that consign others to the prison of shame is a step towards the possibility of real relationship, and in this sense towards the liberation of all beings. With our study of the next precept, we'll widen and deepen this inquiry.